Good afternoon, boa tarde, Presidenta Dilma Rousseff, Provost Richard Locke, faculty, students, and staff from Brown University, and members of the community. On behalf of the Watson Institute for International and Policy Studies and the Brazil Initiative, I would like to welcome you to the Watson Institute Distinguished Speaker Series for a talk this afternoon by President Dilma Rousseff on the challenges for democracy in Brazil. The Brazil Initiative is an interdisciplinary effort to bring together Brown students and professors with scholars from other universities to study the complexities of Brazilian history, culture, politics, and society through a wide range of activities that include guest lectures, workshops, international conferences, and film series. We firmly believe that one cannot understand Brazil's past, present, or even see into the future without engaging with multiple perspectives about understanding this country. This afternoon, President Rousseff will share with us her ideas about the situation in Brazil, followed by an opportunity to respond to questions that were sent previous to this event that we received through the Brazil Initiative. I would like to thank Ramon Stern, the Administrative Manager of the Brazil Initiative, Christine Kelbus, the Events Manager at the Watson Institute, and the other staff at Brown University who made this event a tremendous success. And now I have the pleasure of calling to the stage Provost Richard Locke, who will introduce President Rousseff. Prior to coming to Brown University, Provost Locke was the chair of the Political Science Department at MIT. When he arrived at Brown several years ago to be the director of the Watson Institute, I was delighted to discover that not only had he been a visiting professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, but he also spoke Portuguese fluently with a Brazilian accent. Provost Locke has been a loyal supporter of the Brazil Initiative since its inception, as well as a scholar who has a deep respect for Brazil, its people, and its country. Provost Locke.
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you all. Bem-vindo. É grande prazer poder apresentar a senhora Presidente Dilma Rousseff. Bem-vinda, Presidente. One of the more important roles and responsibilities of institutions like Brown is to serve as a convener, bringing to campus a range of perspectives and views for our community to listen to, consider, challenge, and debate. And it is through direct access to individuals with an array of expertise and experiences that we can sharpen our own views, our own scholarship, and also perhaps develop more refined approaches to some of the more salient issues confronting our society. Today, as part of the Watson Institute's Brazil Initiative, we welcome an individual who has a depth and breadth of experiences that warrant our interest and attention. Dilma Rousseff is an economist, activist, civil servant, former political prisoner, and seasoned politician. She served as the 36th president of Brazil from 2001 until 2016. Born in Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais, she joined the underground movement against the Brazilian military dictatorship in 1965 as a high school student and participated in 2 resistance organizations until she was arrested in early 1970. She was imprisoned for 3 years on the charge of subversion for violating the National Security Act, and during her confinement, she was brutally tortured. After her release in 1973, she moved to Porto Alegre in southern Brazil to be near her husband, who was still serving time in prison for his opposition to the military government. While there, she resumed her education, earning a degree in economics from the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre, and later on a PhD in the same field. Rousseff has been long involved in politics at the local and national levels, including helping to found the Brazilian Democratic Labor Party. She served as the Secretary of Energy for the state of Rio Grande do Sul under 2 administrations, and in 2000, she joined the Workers' Party. And I saw the bandera here earlier. After the former trade union leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was elected president in 2002, Rousseff joined his cabinet as Minister of Mines and Energy, and in 2005, she was appointed as the president's chief of staff and served in that role until being nominated as the Workers' Party's presidential candidate in 2010. In that election, she defeated her main rival, José Serra, of the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, and she was elected again as president in 2014. During her terms in office, she experienced both triumphs and challenges, which I'm not going to take time listing, as I hope that she will share some of this with us during her talk this afternoon. In 2016, she was impeached by the National Congress for allegedly breaking a budgetary law. Although she was removed from the presidency, Dilma Rousseff retains her political rights and is actively participating in debates about Brazil, both nationally and internationally. She currently lives in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil. We as a community, as a university, as an institution with a strong tradition in Portuguese and Brazilian studies, and a commitment through the Brazil Initiative and the Watson Institute and throughout the university to highlight issues related to culture and democracy, governance, economic development, and social inclusion, just to name a few. We're pleased to have the opportunity to welcome Dilma Rousseff to our campus this evening and so that she can offer her very distinctive perspective and voice. Please join me in welcoming a Senhora Presidente Dilma Rousseff to the stage.
Good afternoon, boa tarde.
Good afternoon. I want to salute the Provost, Richard Locke, and thank him for the warm welcoming. To salute, a special salute to Professor James Green for both his welcoming and his invitation. I want to salute the college, the students, the Brown University team, and also to salute the members of the community present here today. I would like to say to you all, I will present basically what we accomplished that I consider fundamental. You all know that Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in Latin America, if not in the world. And because of slavery, and because of the absolute greed of our oligarchies, Brazil was marked by hunger and inequality throughout its history. In the last 13 years, when we took office, President Lula's 2 terms and my 1.5 terms, we made the decision to get Brazil off the hunger map and to overcome extreme poverty at the same time, and also to guarantee an improvement in the lives of the poor. It's very important to recognize that this was a great challenge. Due as much to the number of people living in extreme poverty, around 100 million people, as to the physical space which we had to tackle. Over 8 million square kilometers. However, spanning all of this, there had to be a focus. Our focus was always on the poorest, who encompass almost the majority of the population. For this, we had to initially overcome a perception of the pilot programs, which were characteristic of the previous governments. If a program designed to combat hunger, overcome destitution, and combat poverty in Brazil doesn't take on millions of problems and thus resolve them, it isn't an effective program. This perhaps was our greatest challenge. This graph shows how poverty and extreme poverty have reduced in Brazil over the last few years. You can all see that initially there was a significant reduction in poverty and extreme poverty that occurred during Itamar Franco's presidency, when the Plano Real was adopted. In the following years, there is a stability during the presidency of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, at which time there was no effective policy to combat poverty nor extreme poverty. And then later comes our period, where the drop starts to become a significant drop and really produces effective changes in the context of extreme poverty and the fight against hunger. My government and the government of President Lula, we achieved this. The result was that in 2014, FAO took Brazil off the hunger map. There is the poverty line, the line of overcoming poverty, but FAO took us off the hunger map. We brought down hunger in Brazil. We got off the hunger map. And that is one of the things that we are most proud of. This happened in 2014, at the end of my second term. We were responsible for the third largest reduction of hunger in the world. We saw a reduction of 82% of people who were living in hunger. The success of this strategy that led us to these reductions in extreme poverty and poverty owes itself primarily to the strong political priority that we gave to this agenda. In this strategy towards combating hunger and the distribution of income, a couple of things stand out. First, the evolution during our period of job creation. We had a creation of 20.6 million formal jobs. Obviously, this is only up until 2014, the year of my second election, right? The year in which I ran for re-election. Because from that time on, in 2015, it starts to drop with the political crisis. When, in 2014, we had the lowest unemployment rate in Brazilian history, 4.6%. The policy of valorizing the minimum wage, which resulted in a 71.5% increase between 2013 and 2015, was another explanation for this process. And also, the expansion of family agriculture, responsible for 70% of the products that can be found on any Brazilian table. We know, I think you all know, we are one of the most competitive commercial agriculture exporting countries. But beyond this, we are sustained by a small agriculture, which during our period we incentivized also in a way not only in making available adequate food supplies, but combating hunger in rural areas. And one of the things that allowed for this was that there was an increase in subsidized credit for producers. that went from 2.3 billion reais in the harvest of 2002-2003 to 30 billion reais in the harvest of 2016-2017. Just divide by 3 and you'll get an approximate value in dollars. Government spending guaranteed. We created a policy of government spending to guarantee a systematic demand for the products, without which we wouldn't have had any chance of getting off the hunger map. Beyond this, we created a program to provide electricity in rural areas. There was a part of Brazil in the 21st century which didn't have access to electricity. And where was that? In the rural regions. And who was affected by this? The poorest population of the country. Without these concerns, agriculture and insurance, we wouldn't have had the conditions to supply the internal market, because it's the farmers who, at the same time, were able to improve their income and therefore leave a miserable subsistence situation for a situation in which they were food suppliers. Another important issue was the Bolsa Família program. The Bolsa Família program is strategic. I will speak more about it in a moment. But you can all see that it starts off with 3.6 million families and grows to 14.1, 13.9. Why this fluctuation? Because we audited the program systematically. Every year we audit the program. Why audit? Because there are people that rise above the poverty line, and by getting better jobs, they don't need to receive the help. And in other circumstances, they return to the program. It's a variation that tends to increase now. And why is that? Because there is a very serious economic crisis in Brazil. During my election in 2014, for you all to understand here, this isn't a program that was used politically. At that time, there were indications that we should remove 700,000 to 1.2 million families because they had overcome the conditions of extreme poverty. And I wanted to say also that we improved something very important. We improved nourishment outside of the home through the obligation of the schools to provide meals. And I want to say that it isn't just a snack. We gave a lunch and a snack equivalent to dinner or a hearty breakfast and a lunch. This was a fundamental element for dealing with a delicate question for a country, which is the nourishment of its children. Now I'd like to say to you that this Bolsa Família program was a decisive one, and it was a successful one, and it's still thriving. In 2016, it covered 13.9 million families. Today, it covers more or less the same with some variations, 13 million or I believe 14 million once again. Bolsa Família maintained 26 million people above the extreme poverty line. Each $1,000 transferred to the families produces a multiplying effect of 1.78 in the economy. This is a calculation from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. So I want to say to all that a great characteristic of this program is that it completed our network of social protection. Our network of social protection, I'll come back to this later. Our network of social protection has a welfare part, unemployment insurance, and a part which provided benefits for the elderly and poor people with disabilities. The network was integrated because of this, and we determined that young couples, with or without children, were completely unprotected in precarious and vulnerable situations. That's why Bolsa Família completed this network. It provided the families with the support of the Brazilian state. So why did Bolsa Família succeed? First, because it was a unified program. Second, because it was built upon a digital platform. We created a registration gradually. We started with what we already had registered. We unified the registration, and we started registering people in such a way that today in Brazil, we have an absolutely comprehensive registry of families in vulnerable situations, or that have left vulnerable situations, or that might return to vulnerable situations. Because we maintain this margin of possibility for people to leave and come back, depending on the fluctuations in the job market and the opportunities available. Priority was given to women in receiving the fundamental tool of the program, which was a credit card. A credit card. A digital credit card, which eliminated the relationship of clientelism and created a relationship of citizenship in which women, generally women, 90% or more than 90% were women. They would go to the bank, Caixa Econômica Federal, with their card and would take out monthly their amount. This is a process which I think allowed for a real change in the families, especially because we had a requirement. We had a requirement. This requirement was the following. We required that in regards to health, there were 3 required prenatal consultations for the pregnant women in Bolsa Família program. We therefore increased prenatal health by 50%. There was a 14% reduction in the premature birth rate, and between ages 0 to 5, vaccination was obligatory. 99% of Brazilian children were vaccinated. And this meant that we saw a 46% decrease in mortality because of diarrhea and a 58% reduction in mortality caused by malnutrition. These numbers are important because we had 2 offsets. Children must be vaccinated and they must attend school. Those who don't attend school leave the program. Those whose mother does not place the child in school leave the program. The family that doesn't vaccinate its kids doesn't receive Bolsa Família. This was very important for the women because they had a central role. The Brazilian woman occupies a familial position, without which we wouldn't have been able to create this social program. There was no chance of reaching 56 million people without this emphasis on the women. So, I want to say that, obviously, this is one aspect. But what characterizes our policy was the digital aspect. Digital with a focus in all of our programs on the poorest, all of them, without exception. That's why we got out of this discussion, which happens so often, between specific policies and universalizing policies. What we discovered from our experience was that there is no chance of creating universalizing policy in a country with such an income distribution as ours, in Brazil, if you don't start with the poor. If you don't start with the poorest, the efficacy of your policy is compromised. This happened with the issue of the doctors, which I spoke about today with some of the members here of the group of Brown students and professors. With the Mais Médicos program, the fact is that Brazil didn't have enough doctors to maintain the basic healthcare program, without which structure, the unified public health system, between 85 and 86% of health problems are resolved in primary care. And this meant that we had 18,000 doctors that entered into this program from 2013 on, allowing for us to care for 63 million people. Where were they? They, the poor people, were on the outskirts of São Paulo and other major cities. They were concentrated also in the medium-sized cities. The indigenous people in the departments of indigenous health, who are today covered and structure the unified public health system, without which this unified public health system wouldn't work as it should, connecting the clinical part with another complexity. All this we did during this period. And I want to say that beyond the Mais Médicos program, we created a housing program for 4 million people. 80% of the housing deficit in Brazil affects those who earn up to 1,600 reais. In other words, a family with 4 children that earns up to 1,600 reais. The program was not a bubble because it was subsidized. This group, the poorest group, right, had a significant subsidiary in the loan they paid, in their loan payment. And it allowed for, because there was a large subsidiary, perhaps the largest subsidiary of the government in my time and Lula's time, went towards this housing program. I would say, in basic terms, that there may be other programs. We created water access programs in the Semiárido region of Brazil. We created 1.3 million reservoirs, which we called cisterns, to guarantee access to water. Obviously, beyond the great infrastructure works, such as the interconnection of the San Francisco River, what was done here with the Mississippi River, we did with the San Francisco River. What I want to say to you all is that what's going on today in Brazil? What's going on today in Brazil is that this is at risk. This social protection system and all of the policies we created, they are all at risk. And why are they at risk? Because, and I won't speak right away about the motives for the coup. I will try to explain why they are already at risk. A constitutional amendment was approved, amendment number 55. With this amendment, spending during a 20-year period, spending on health and education, can only have an effective growth. In a country where there is a demand, a preeminence for spending on health and education, this is brinkmanship. The service of public demands is going to suffer a great loss. Take the case of education. We created a policy of social inclusion, integrating a part of the population that had never had a chance of getting into university, neither through the public schooling system nor through private scholarships.
no ensino privado, né? Nós trocávamos
We exchanged taxes for scholastic scholarships in a program called ProUni.
Agora, o gasto
Now,
em
the spending on
educação
education
é
is a
gasto
growing
no Brasil,
expenditure in Brazil.
É crescente. Por que é crescente? Porque se trata
Why is it
não
growing?
de uma população
Because it's not a stable
estabilizada,
population.
Porque tem estoque.
Because we have a stock,
imenso
an
de
immense stock of
pessoas
people
que vão
who will
demandar cada vez
increasingly
mais,
demand
aquelas que não
more.
tiveram, as que
Those
estão
who never
em
had
curso
access,
e
those who are
aquelas que vão
studying,
entrar.
and those who are about to
Não existe
enter.
como fazer isso.
There's no way
Essa
to
é uma
do this.
mágica que não dá pra
This
ser
is a
feita.
magic
A
trick
não
that
ser que
doesn't
você
work without
não
privileging
privilegie a
education.
educação. E pro Brasil, a educação
And for
tem
Brazil,
duas
education
forças.
has two
Uma
strengths.
força que é
One strength, which is to
perenizar a
perpetuate the
distribuição de
income
renda, porque essa
distribution.
questão de distribuição de renda,
Because this question of
ela é
income,
volátil.
it's volatile.
A renda pode, diferente
Income,
da
unlike
riqueza,
wealth,
a renda
can
pode
oscillate.
oscilar. A riqueza é o quê?
What is wealth?
Educação e casa.
Education and housing,
Moradia e
housing and
e
education,
educação. E
and
aposentadoria.
retirement.
A riqueza
Wealth is the
que é o
three-legged
tripé
apparatus
que
that
garante
guarantees
uma
stability
estabilidade
for families
pras
and implies
famílias,
income,
implica em renda,
education,
educação
and retirement.
e aposentadoria.
I won't
Não
even
vou nem
speak about
falar
health and safety.
da saúde e da segurança,
I won't
vou
speak
falar
about this,
disso, mas
but these are
essas
two
duas
issues
questões são
that are
essenciais.
essential.
E há outro problema do Brasil.
And
é o
Brazil's
seguinte,
other
o Brasil,
problem
ao
is the
contrário do que
following.
pensam, não é um
Brazil,
país
contrary to what many think, is not a producer of commodities.
avião.
Brazil is a country that produces airplanes, that possesses and has dominated the technology required for petroleum extraction,
Abaixo da lâmina d'água,
7,000 meters below the water surface.
nós
We
e algumas
and some
algumas
other
outras
large
grandes
companies
empresas dominamos
dominate this technology.
tirar no fundo do mar
To
a
remove
7
from the
mil
bottom of
metros
the
de lâmina
ocean
d'água com alta
7,000
temperatura e alta
meters below the
pressão,
surface,
implica em alta tecnologia. E
there
hoje
is
nós
a
tiramos,
variation
não é a 7 mil,
of
mas tem uma
5,000
variação
to
de
2,500,
5.500 para
more or
2.000
less, meters. In
metros,
other words,
mais ou menos,
2.5
2
kilometers
metros, ou seja, 2
below the
quilômetros
water surface.
e meio abaixo da lâmina d'água. Nós hoje já produzimos
We
1
today
milhão e 800
have already
mil barris,
produced
quando diziam, não, vocês não vão
1.8
produzir.
million
Produzimos,
barrels.
sim, senhor. Isto
So when they say,
significa-
no,
significa
you won't
produção
be
de
able to
commodity.
produce any oil,
Produz,
well, we
você tem
did.
de produzir
Yes, sir.
equipamento, plataforma,
This means
toda a
it doesn't
estrutura
mean the production of
de
commodities.
geração
You have to
energética
produce
para extrair
equipment,
petróleo. Não é
platforms,
algo trivial.
all
A
of the
mesma coisa,
structure
nós
for
temos
energy generation for petroleum
várias
extraction.
cadeias produtivas.
It's not
Não
something
somos,
trivial.
porque é uma
The same thing.
versão que
We
nós
have a number
somos
of
um país de
productive
commodities.
change. We aren't, because there seems to be an idea that we are a country of commodities.
Elas são responsáveis
We're very
pelo fato
welcome
que
to
nós
commodities.
acumulamos, durante o período
During the
de
period of
commodities,
commodities, we
380
accumulated
bilhões de dólares em
$380
reserva.
billion
O
in
Brasil
reserve.
deve ser o quinto país
Brazil is probably the fifth
reserva
country in terms
de
of
dólares.
reserve in dollars.
Por isso que eu, continuando, queria dizer para os senhores
Because of this,
que
moving
o
on,
que está em
I
risco?
want to say to you
Está
all,
em risco
what is
uma
at risk?
mudança de modelo no Brasil. Por
The
4
model
eleições,
change is at risk in Brazil.
Eles perderam o confronto
For
de
4
modelo.
elections,
De
they
lado,
lost the model
modelo que eles
conflict.
tinham, e de outro lado, o nosso modelo. O modelo deles
On the
está
one
expresso
side, the
nessa
model
emenda
they had,
constitucional.
on the other, our
Congela
model.
por 20 anos o gasto, em termos reais, o
Their
gasto
model is
com saúde e
evident in this
educação.
constitutional amendment.
Aceita que
Freeze spending for 20
nominalmente
years.
caia o gasto em assistência
Bury
social,
spending on health and education,
ciência e tecnologia,
except that spending will
o
nominally
gasto
decrease.
em segurança, o gasto em habitação,
Basically,
enfim,
everything
todo
covered by
aquilo
the
que
budget
no
jargon
jargão
called primary
orçamentário
expense.
se chama despesa primária. E congela
And freeze
congela
this for 20 years.
isto por
Take the
20
poor out of the
tira
budget
os pobres do orçamento e tira a população
and
da
take the
decisão sobre o
population
orçamento.
out of the
Porque
decision
que é
about the
governo?
budget.
Governo
Because what
é
is a
aquele
government?
órgão que
A
decide
government is
onde
that
gastar,
organ which decides
como gastar,
where
com
to
quem
spend,
gastar, com
how
quem
to
gastar.
spend, with
Ora,
whom to
quando
spend,
você tira por
and
20
on
anos,
whom to
você
spend.
está fazendo
Now,
duas
when
coisas.
you
Você está
take
tirando
away
os
for
pobres
20
do
years,
orçamento
you're
e
doing
está
two
ferindo a
things.
democracia e a
You're taking the
Constituição.
poor out of the
Então,
budget, and you are
esse
hurting
processo é um
democracy and the
processo
Constitution.
gravíssimo, porque quem-
And so this
quem é
process
primeiro atingido?
is
Os
really a
pobres,
grave
os
one,
mais frágeis.
because who is the
Porque
first
os
to be
mais
affected?
ricos não
The poor,
precisam
the
tanto
most
do
fragile.
gasto em educação
Because
e
the
saúde.
rich don't need
Os
as
mais
much of
ricos
the spending on
precisam menos.
education and health.
Mas isso também
The wealthy need less.
torna esse tipo de
But this
política
type of
torna
policy
também
makes more complicated the lives of the wealthy and even those of the middle class. It makes their lives extremely more complicated. It doesn't just affect them. In the medium term, it will affect the whole Brazilian population. And so, this PAC, beyond being very complicated, because it's the first step to implanting neoliberalism in Brazil, it is also clearly anti-democratic. Because by taking away for 20 years 5 presidential elections, in the decision of 5 presidents, how is it that spending, and why is it that only you prioritize and dispense with financial expenses, interest payments? Why? There is no explanation. This discussion in Brazil is banned. Because whoever tries to talk about it, the person who tries to talk about it, shouldn't be taken very seriously. That's how it's treated. So, I want to say to you all, and now I'll speak about the coup. I'm inverting somewhat. At the end of the day, why did they stage a coup in Brazil? Why? What are the causes for the coup? First, I affirm that it is a coup. I affirm that it is a coup while knowing that there are many people who say, but they respect the parliamentary rights, all of the constitutional rights. So it's not a coup. I have lived 2 coups. I lived through the dictatorship coup, and that's why I was arrested. I spent 3 years in prison, in political prison. There was torture in Brazil. There was, from a certain moment onward, a policy of killing political opponents. And there were many comrades who were killed. Others were exiled. I know perfectly well what a dictatorship is. A dictatorship implies integral removal of the right to organize, the right to expression, the right to free press, and the right to protest. Worse yet, the right to safeguard your own life. And so a dictatorship is this, and the military coup that happened in Brazil and Latin America instituted this. It was widespread. A parliamentary coup isn't the same. Today, a military coup is completely out of fashion. Why is it out of fashion? The Cold War ended. There was also a process of understanding in the Latin American countries in regards to the terrible consequences on society. When one part of it strikes against what is most sacred in the other, their humanity. He who tortures wounds humanity. He who kills wounds humanity. Who persecutes the political enemy wounds humanity. All of our societies, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru, in Chile, in Uruguay, learned from this. What's going on today in some of the Latin American countries and in Brazil is exemplary. It's a parliamentary coup which has different characteristics. What are the characteristics of the parliamentary coup? Generally, impeachment is used as a mechanism to remove the president. When you are in the parliamentary regime, it's perfectly possible that the parliament could issue a vote of no confidence towards the prime minister or the cabinet, and he would be removed. On the other hand, it's very possible that, for specific reasons, the prime minister or the cabinet call for new elections. There are checks and balances.
Nós seguimos a linha americana
We followed the American line of
e
presidentialism.
a linha do presidente.
And in the American line of presidentialism, there are explained conditions for the removal of the president via impeachment.
O impeachment, mas explicou em que condições. Se eu vou
I'll
citar
cite
de
them from
cabeça,
memory:
traição,
treason,
suborno
bribery,
e high crime
and
and
high
misdemeanors.
crimes and misdemeanors.
E condicionou
The process requires one of these crimes.
a existência dessa substância.
Without this,
Sem isso,
in any
em
place
qualquer
in the
lugar
world
do mundo, no sistema
which
presidencial,
governs by
você
presidentialism,
tem golpe de Estado.
you have a coup d'etat.
Tanto é assim que no julgamento
So much so
do presidente
that in the trial of President Clinton,
citado pelo Roberto Nagel,
cited by
há
Robert
momento
Nagel,
em que
there was a moment in which a congressman
parlamentar
said,
diz o seguinte:
and now if it happens
"Ora,
this way,
pois, se acontecer
what he said
dessa
was a bit
forma,
harsher,
é mais, vamos dizer, a fala é um pouquinho mais
but
dura,
I
mas
don't
eu não
have
tô
it
com
here
ela
to
aqui pra
cite word for
citar
word.
Literalmente. Ele é um
He
pouquinho
was
mais
a bit harsher.
Trata-se de coup
It's a
d'État.
coup d'etat, he said.
seja,
In other words, a coup d'etat.
Ou seja, o que eu quero dizer é o seguinte:
In other
pode
words,
cumprir o
what I
que
want to
quiser.
say is the following.
Se houver conteúdo
You can comply with
no
whatever
Brasil,
right
o
you
high
want.
crimes e misdemeanors
In Brazil,
chama-se
high
crime
crimes
de
and misdemeanors
responsabilidade.
is called a crime of
O que é um
liability.
crime de responsabilidade?
What
Bem
is a crime of
parecido com os
liability?
Estados Unidos. Porque nós seguimos
It's
a
very
tradição
similar with what you
republicana
have here in the United
americana.
States
O Brasil
because
seguiu
we
esse
followed
modelo.
the American Republican tradition.
E aí,
Brazil followed this model.
o que acontece comigo? Do que
And
me
so,
acusaram?
What happened
Me
with me?
acusaram, e é
What did they
interessante,
accuse
isso
me
que eu vou
of?
falar,
They
três
accused me.
decretos.
It's interesting, and that's why I'll speak
Três
about it.
decretos.
Of 3
E
decrees,
de
okay?
fazer plano safra.
3 decrees.
Subsídio
And
aquele
of
lá.
creating a stockpiling
Os
plan,
três decretos,
the subsidiary here.
a parte
The 3
da
decrees,
qual
the
eu sou
part of which
acusado
I am
dos três
accused,
decretos,
in the 3
corresponde a
decrees,
0,15%
corresponded
das
to
despesas primárias, não é nem do
0.15%
orçamento,
of the primary
das
expense.
despesas primárias,
Not even the
menor
budget,
que o orçamento.
smaller than the budget,
0,15%.
0.15%.
Além disso,
Beyond this,
a outra parte, que
the
é
other part is that the
o
Banco do Brasil,
por uma lei de
by a 1994 law,
1994, subsidia a
subsidized
agricultura
Brazilian
brasileira em
agriculture in credit.
crédito. Isto não passa.
It's not
não é
standardized
normatizado
by the
pelos
presidents.
presidentes, é normatizado por lei.
It's
Todos os
standardized
presidentes que me
by the
antecederam
law.
praticaram
All of the
os
presidents that
decretos
came
e
before me committed the
praticaram-
decrees.
Só que praticaram mais decretos do que
Only
eu.
they
Eu sou
committed
3.
more
Tem
decrees
presidente
than
que
I did.
praticou 100. Então, o que
There are
acontece?
presidents
No
who
caso
have committed
do
100
Safra,
decrees.
Nenhum presidente participa da
So,
execução.
what happens?
Nem eu, nem
In the
nenhum
case
outro
of the stockpiling
participa.
plan,
Tanto
no
que
president participates in the execution, not
O
myself
auditor
and not any
disse
other,
o seguinte, se vão
such that the
condenar o
auditor
presidente
said
por isso,
that
então
if they were
condenem
going
todos
to
os
condemn me for this,
Todos
then
os
they would
outros
have to
desde
condemn
94.
all the others since
Na
94.
verdade, procuraram
Indeed,
argumento.
they looked for an
Hoje,
argument.
Muito poucas pessoas
Today,
acreditam nesses argumentos.
few people believe these
Agora,
arguments.
quem deu o golpe?
Now, who staged the
Quem deu o
coup?
golpe deu por um motivo.
Whoever staged the
Uma
coup
parte deu porque queria
did
evitar
so
sangria.
because they had a
E
motive.
Não fui eu que inventei a
Part
palavra
of the coup
sangria,
was staged
não
to
fui
avoid
eu
bloodletting.
que declarei que era por isso.
And it
Isso
wasn't me
eles-
that invented the word bloodletting.
Houve uma gravação.
It wasn't
dois
me that
senadores,
declared that the coup was
golpista
because of this.
E o outro que estava sendo investigado.
There was a recording
e
between two
o
senators.
golpista disse, "Temos que
One, a
afastar
coup
presidenta
plotter,
Dilma para
and the
estancar a
other was
sangria,
being investigated.
evitando que as investigações da Lava
The coup
Jato
plotter
cheguem até
said,
nós, porque
"We have
ela
to get
não vai
Dilma out of the
impedir esse
picture to staunch the bloodletting, to make
Essa
sure
eu
we're not
digo,
caught in the
eu
car
acho
wash
que isso é
investigation,
uma-
because she won't stop it."
argumento.
This
mas
is
não é a
one
razão
argument,
principal.
but
A
it's
razão
not the
principal
principal
é
reason.
enquadrar o Brasil
The principal
econômica,
reason
social
is
e
to
geopolítica.
frame Brazil
Essa é a razão principal.
economically,
A razão principal
socially,
é fazer
and
com que o Brasil
geopolitically.
tenha
This is the
Estado
principal reason.
mínimo,
The principal
não
reason
faça política
was to
social,
enact a
que o Brasil
minimal rule of
não
law
tenha
without social
uma defesa
policies
clara
and without a clear defense of our country's wealth, such that Brazil is reframed economically and socially. Not to say that we don't defend a multilateral policy from an external point of view. We are in favor of relationships with every country, with Latin America as our neighbors, with Africa because we have the largest population of black people outside of Africa, with the other emerging countries because we participate in and created BRICS and its Investment and Development Bank and its Contingent Reserve Agreement, which is a variant of the International Monetary Fund between our currencies. In closing, I want to say something. We, and I believe this process is one in which, more than ever, makes us have to defend democracy. It happened because democracy allowed us to win office 4 times. There wouldn't be any other way to apply the program if they hadn't removed us by way of the parliamentary coup. I believe in democracy because I think that democracy facilitates all of the possible and effective transformations in Brazil. There is no other path for Brazil other than the extension of democracy. Democracy must be extended to the institutional arena in defense of free and direct elections, in defense of the electoral system, for the Brazilian electoral system is compromised. And if later there is opportunity in the Q&A section, I will speak more about the compromised electoral system. But I believe also in the participation of the people. We created, throughout our government, national conferences. We listen to all of the trends. And this is what made possible many of these constructions. And this is the only way, this democratic path for Brazil, a country with such complexity and diversity, so similar to the complexity and diversity here in the United States, but with a different threshold of economic, social, political, and cultural development. Such a country dearly needs democracy. We cannot construct Brazil as a fair nation for its people, a developed nation, a nation that is not the country of commodities. It's a country that wants to be diverse, that wants to enter into the knowledge economy. Only democracy will lead us to this. And so this is why I say to you all that when we had democracy in Brazil, we advanced. When we lost it, we regressed. And this is what I think is the most decisive thing, process, fight, path of the moment. It's to fight for democratic rights for the country's population. Thank you very much.
So is my microphone working? Yes? Okay, good. So prior to this event, we sent out a request to the people who asked for tickets to send us questions, and I'm going to be reading them and telling who sent the questions in. We'll see how much time we have to answer all the questions. The first one comes from Ari Snyder, who's a Portuguese and Brazilian Studies major, and he wants to know, what are the reasons that brought you to decide to join the resistance against the dictatorship? And what was your experience like when you were in prison?
My generation, when the coup happened, I was 16. And when I was arrested, I was 21.
naquele
What was
período
clear at that
para a minha
time
geração
for my generation
foi algo
was something very,
muito forte.
very strong.
Houve uma imensa desilusão.
There was a great
Da minha
sense of
geração.
disappointment on the part of my
Quando deram o
generation.
golpe, eles tiram
Because
algumas
when they
coisas
stage a
das
coup,
pessoas. Não
they
tiram
take
só a
things
vida
from the lives
democrática.
of the people, not
Tiram a
just democratic
esperança de
life,
que a via democrática
but they also
te
take away
leve,
the hope that the democratic way
te permita transformações.
will allow for
O Brasil, naquele
transformation.
momento, teve
Brazil at that
processo
time
de
went through a
desilusão, porque
process
estava em vias
of disillusionment
governo
because
com
there was
uma
in sight
proposta de
a
transformação,
government
de
with
reformas.
proposal.
Processo, governo que
Proposals
tinha
for
uma proposta de
transformation,
crescimento, uma
proposals for
proposta de
growth,
reformas.
proposals
ele
for reform.
É retirado.
And then
O
this
Brasil já
government was
tinha
removed.
sofrido,
Brazil had
variantes
already
de golpe
suffered a
antes,
variation of coups before,
mas essa eu acho que se deu no momento
but this
de
happened
muita
during a moment of
esperança
much
anterior,
hope
de muito
and investment.
investimento interior, anterior. Nós todos,
We
eu
all,
acho que,
I think, the people
as
believed
pessoas
that it would work
acreditavam
out.
que aquilo iria dar certo. Então, a
And
perda,
so
essa
the
perda,
loss this
levou
loss
a uma parte da minha
led a
geração
part
de
of my
grande
generation
desilusão
to a great
democrática,
sense of
que é
disappointment in
grave,
democracy,
é gravíssimo.
which is
Pior
extremely
coisa
grave.
que pode acontecer.
The worst thing that could happen.
E se me perguntarem qual o pior
And if you
efeito
ask me, what was the
da
worst
ditadura
effect
brasileira, além
of
de
the Brazilian
matar,
dictatorship,
torturar, eu acho que é
besides the killing,
destruir
besides the torture,
esperanças. Mas a
I
vida
think
é
it was this
complexa.
destruction of hope.
Esse mesmo processo
But life is
que leva
complicated. The
toda a
same
minha
process
geração,
that led my whole
ou uma
generation,
parte expressiva
or a
dela,
specific part of it,
combater a ditadura,
to fight the
a
dictatorship,
resistir,
to resist,
e acaba
and that
que
landed
nos
us in
leva
jail
pra
because we
prisão,
believed that we were
porque nós
obligated to
acreditávamos
resist. We
que
believed that we
tínhamos
were obligated to
obrigação
fight.
de resistir, tínhamos obrigação de combater, e que
And
de uma
in a
certa
certain
forma,
way,
isso
this weighed on our
estava nas
shoulders.
nossas costas e que isso era,
It was our
era uma
obligation.
obrigação, era uma questão de
It was a
honra.
matter of honor.
E vamos para cadeia, né? Vamos
Let's
pra
go to
prisão,
jail.
sofremos
Let's go to
tortura.
prison. We were
De repente,
tortured.
eu sei, com 21 anos,
Suddenly,
22,
at 21,
vira adulto
22 years old,
bastante
you become an adult.
velho,
Adult.
adulto
A very clever
bem
adult
esperto, adulto
who
entende, passa a entender
begins to
como as
understand how
coisas
things
funcionam.
work.
Não precisa de ir para cadeia
To
para
be
entender
sure,
não, viu, gente?
You don't need to go to jail to understand
Mas
how life
nós
works.
entendemos lá.
But we
Foi
understood
lá
it
que
there.
nós compreendemos.
It was there that we learned
aí,
this.
Que coisa
And
engraçada.
What a funny thing,
A importância
the
da
importance
questão
of
democrática,
democracy.
ela surge mais
We had
forte pra nós,
experienced all of the
porque nós
recessions,
tínhamos experimentado.
and it was
todas as
like
recessões.
an awakening
E aí,
because it's
é
not
como se
individual.
despertasse, porque não é individual,
It's not
não é só de
one
uma pessoa
specific
específica.
person.
Isso faz parte
It belongs to a group of
de um
people
conjunto de
that have
pessoas
had this experience
que têm essa
and that
experiência e
understand
percebem que no Brasil nós
that
temos de
we
lutar
have
pela
to
democracia,
fight for democracy
que não
in
adianta
Brazil.
achar que tem outro método de
So
chegar
it doesn't do
à
any good to think that there is some
transformação, que era o que a
other
gente
way of
achava
achieving transformation,
na resistência.
which is what we thought in the
E que
resistance,
você precisava de expandir
and that
os
you needed to
espaços
expand
democráticos.
democratic spaces.
Ter jornal, escrever no jornal,
To
e
have a
dar sua
newspaper
opinião era
and write in
algo
the newspaper
fundamental. Que ter o direito de se
to give your
organizar
opinion
era algo
was something
fundamental.
fundamental.
De que
The right to
participar das
organize
lutas
was
sociais,
fundamental.
dos trabalhadores,
To
do pessoal sem
participate in the
terra,
social
do
struggles
pessoal,
of the
sem
workers
terra, era
and of the
algo
landless
que
movement.
fazia parte do
That was
caminho de
something that
construção,
belonged
que não
to a
seria.
path of
Não
construction.
adianta achar que é assim.
It
Não
doesn't
é.
do any
O
good to think it's
povo,
like that.
O seu povo,
It's not like that.
a
The
democracia
people,
é isso, é
your
seu povo
people,
tem de participar.
that's what democracy
Então,
is.
eu acho que foi
The
aprendizado.
people have to
Eu fui
participate.
por uma
So I
desilusão.
think it was a learning experience.
cheguei a
From a
construir a
disappointment,
Você veja
I
como
was
é
able
que
to arrive
é muito
at hope.
rica a
You
vida.
see how life is
Eu
rich.
acho que isso aconteceu
And
na
I think
América
this is what
Latina.
happened throughout all of Latin America.
This is a question from Amy Nunn, who's a professor of public health at Brown University. And she wrote in, I wrote a book about Brazil's remarkable and trailblazing policies to treat people living with HIV. Brazil's policies also influence global public health policies about drug prices and access to AIDS treatment. Brazil's public health system and HIV care infrastructures are threatened by Brazil's economic and political crisis. Can you comment about the ways forward for access to HIV treatment and care in Brazil?
Olha,
Look,
a legislação
the Brazilian
brasileira
legislation secures
assegura
access to
o acesso
HIV treatment
ao tratamento do HIV para todas as
for
pessoas
all
que
of
precisam.
those who need it.
Esse acesso
This
é um
This
acesso
access
garantido, ele
is a
foi
guaranteed
conquistado
access.
no processo
It
de
was won during the
democratização no
process of
Brasil.
Brazilian
Nós
democratization.
tivemos grandes conquistas.
We
Uma
had
das
many
conquistas,
victories,
que não tá ligada
one
ao
of which,
ao meu governo, ao do
which
Lula,
isn't
foi
related to
a
my
conquista
administration or
de
Lula's
tratamento de
administration,
HIV
was the
universal,
achievement of a universal HIV
garantido
treatment,
pelo Sistema Único de Saúde.
guaranteed by the
Isso
unified public
significa
health
que
system.
não há como se fazer uma
This
previsão
means
de
that
quanto
there's
você vai
no
gastar,
way for you
com
to make a
com os remédios.
prediction of how much you will
Quanto você
spend
vai
on
colocar
medication,
à disposição.
how much you will make available.
Então, eu digo o
And
seguinte,
so
uma das
I'll say the
consequências que
following.
eu acho grave dessa
One of the
emenda
grave
constitucional
consequences I find of this
você
constitutional
não
amendment
pode, no Brasil, fixar
is
pra
that in
saúde e
Brazil,
educação
you
um
can't
teto
set a cap on
baseado
education and
no
healthcare
aumento real.
based on the immediate
Não
moment.
pode fazer isso.
You
Porque
can't do
tem
this
flutuações.
because there are
E essas
fluctuations,
flutuações têm de ser atendidas.
and
No
these
Sistema Único de
fluctuations need to
Saúde
be prolonged.
e no sistema que
In the
no
unified
sistema
public
que
health system,
assegura
and in the system which,
o atendimento de HIV,
because the system
ele
that
tá em
secures
cima
the
do sistema
HIV
de saúde, é o
service,
sistema de
it's
saúde
on top of the
que
unified public health
executa.
system.
Mas
It's the health
é
system
a
that
lei,
executes the
tem
service,
uma
but it's
lei
the law.
mandatória,
It's a
tem
mandatory
que
law.
fazer,
You
não
must
tem
do it.
conversa.
There's no way around it.
Então, o que eu acho
So what I think was
ficou
undermined in
tudo
Brazil
abalado
with
no
this
Brasil
question of
nessa
rights,
questão dos
that's why we
direitos,
say it's a
e aí
regression.
por isso que a gente
It's
fala
because
que é um retrocesso, é porque com essa camisa de força que é
With
a
this
emenda
straitjacket
55,
that is the Amendment
você, a partir do
55,
momento, você não sabe
you,
o que
from a
vai
certain
ser
moment
feito, como é
onward,
que eles vão-
you don't know what's going to
vão,
be done,
equacionar
how
o
they're going to
orçamento. E eu quero dizer
calculate
uma
the
coisa
budget.
pra vocês.
And I want to say to you all,
Acho que tem uma contradição.
I think that there is a
hoje.
contradiction.
Hoje o Brasil vive
Today,
uma contradição que é a seguinte.
Brazil is living a
O
contradiction,
governo golpista tem de entregar
which I believe to be the following.
conjunto de
The
projetos
coup administration, they have to hand over a series
a
of
mídia, parte
projects,
da mídia e
that
parte do mercado,
a part to the
apoiou
media
esse
and
governo.
another part to the market.
Se entregar esses
They both
projetos.
support this administration
deles é aposentadoria.
if it delivers these projects,
Sem aposentadoria
one of which is retirement.
e sem essa radical
Without retirement,
corte na
and without this
aposentadoria,
radical
a emenda
cut to
55
retirement,
não é viável.
the 55th Amendment
Se eles
is
não
not
entregarem,
feasible.
eles perdem
If they don't deliver
o
it,
apoio
they lose the
da
support
mídia,
from a
de parte da mídia,
part of the
da
media
grande mídia e parte
and from a part of the
do
market.
mercado. Se eles entregarem,
If they
eles
deliver,
se autodestroem
they will
diante da
self-destruct
população.
in front of the
Vai
population.
ter eleição.
There will be
2018.
elections in 2018.
Ninguém, eu pelo menos
No
não
one,
conheço nenhum
at least
político
I don't know a
que
single
é
politician
suicida.
that's willing to kill themselves
Não
in front of the
duvido
populace.
muito que essa contradição
And so
não
I
seja
doubt that much of this
contradição que cria
contradiction
impasse.
isn't a contradiction
Esse
that
é um
wouldn't
problema
lead
sério, porque
to
cada
an
vez
impasse.
mais, no início, as pessoas
And this
não
is a
tinham
serious
percepção
problem
clara
because
sobre a emenda 55,
increasingly,
as consequências.
in the beginning, the people,
Agora, as pessoas
they didn't
se
have a clear
mobilizaram por
perception
causa
of the
da Previdência.
consequences of Amendment number
Porque a
55.
Previdência, a
Now the
situação
people
é
have
muito dramática.
mobilized because
Então,
of Social
nisso
Security.
tudo,
Why?
algumas questões
Because
estão ficando
Social
cada vez
Security,
mais claras.
the situation
Como é
is
que
pretty
fica os
dramatic.
remédios?
So in
A-
all of
a-
this,
a-
some
a
concerns are
HIV.
becoming
Como
more
é que
and more
ficam os
clear.
mais médicos, os
And so what
18
happens to
mil,
HIV
230
medication?
médicos que
What
atendem
happens to the
63
Mais
milhões,
Magicus program?
que está-
To the
que está sobreposto ao SUS?
18,230 doctors
Como é que
that care for
fica
63 million
o
people
pagamento
that
de um
overlaps with
programa
the
que
public
chama-
health
que tem
system?
farmácia popular,
What happens to the
que você
payment for a
diminui
program
o
that's
atendimento
called,
hospitalar,
that has pharmacies?
que a gente fez uma pesquisa e
We
percebeu
noticed
o
in a
seguinte,
survey that there is a
há uma
disease,
doença crônica,
that there
tem
are
algumas
some
doenças que são
chronic
crônicas.
diseases.
Exemplo,
For example,
pressão alta, tô falando
high blood
simplificando,
pressure,
e diabetes.
I'm simplifying here, and
Nós
diabetes.
asseguramos para as pessoas pobres
We secured
remédio
free
de
diabetes and
diabetes
blood pressure
e
medication
de
for the
pressão
poor.
alta, gratuito.
But because we have this
pessoa,
registry,
ela, como a gente tem
we know
cadastro,
whether the
a gente
person
sabe se a
has the
pessoa tem
right
direito
to
ou não
this
tem
free
direito.
medication.
Só pode ser pra
In other
pessoa
words, a person who can
pobre.
prove that their
Pessoa
income
que
is insufficient
comprovadamente não tem renda suficiente para manter, porque são remédios.
Because these
mesmo
medications are
os
expensive,
genéricos são caros.
even
Então,
the
tudo isso,
generic
não sei
ones.
se eles
So
vão
I don't know if they're going to maintain all of this,
Não há, se mantiver
if they can maintain their real growth
o
within the
crescimento
constitutional
real, é o
cap.
crescimento real pelo limite constitucional. Nós geralmente gastávamos
Usually, we would
40
spend
a
between
50
40
milhões
to
além
50
do
million
constitucional.
beyond the constitutional
Então,
cap.
quero ver como é que isso vai ser equacionado.
So
Mas
I
vai
want to
ver,
see how this will be
acho que vai
calculated.
ficar
I think it's
muito
going to be
difícil.
very hard for HIV.
This is a question from Julie Wu, who's a class of 2017, and she's a student from Brazil. And she writes, what can you tell the young, talented Brazilians currently studying abroad who are reluctant to go back to Brazil due to their perception of the current political, social, and economic crisis, or conditions, excuse me?
Eu acho que todo mundo no Brasil
I
hoje,
think that everyone in Brazil
tem de
today
ir pro
has to
Brasil.
go to Brazil.
Por quê?
Why?
Não depende de
It's not the responsibility of any entity or authority superior to us
resolver o
to
problema
resolve
do
the
Brasil.
problem of Brazil.
Estudante
A student
fora do
that
Brasil,
has studied outside of
que teve,
Brazil
de uma forma ou de outra,
and that has, in one way or another,
dos
received
impostos
support
pagos
from the
pela
taxes
população
paid by the
brasileira,
Brazilian
deve à
population,
população brasileira voltar.
owes
E aí
it to
eu
the
vou
Brazilian
falar
people to
pra
come back.
aqueles
And so I'll
milhares
speak to those
do Ciências Sem
thousands of
Fronteiras.
students in the
Eu acho
Ciências
o
Sem
programa
Fronteiras
Ciências Sem
program.
Fronteiras dos programas
I
que
think
eu
that the
tenho mais
Ciências Sem
orgulho de
Fronteiras
ter feito.
program is one of the
Que
programs I
garantia ao
am most
estudante
proud of having
brasileiro
created,
ter acesso às
that
melhores
guaranteed the
universidades.
Brazilian student
Eu sei que eles
access to the best
suspenderam o
universities. I know that they
Acho,
suspended the program.
Absurdo,
I think it's a
absoluta cegueira.
total
Podiam
blindness.
modificar, podiam
They could have
adaptar,
modified
mas
it, they
suspender
could have
é
adapted it,
absolutamente
but to have
imperdoável.
suspended it is
Então,
absolutely
eu quero dizer que eu
unforgivable.
acredito.
And so
Eu
I want to
acredito
say
no
that I
Brasil,
believe.
eu acho que nós
I believe in
temos
Brazil.
de perceber que
I
país
think that we have to
que tem
realize
aquela
that a
quantidade
country
de
that has
riqueza,
that amount of wealth,
que tem
that
energia,
has energy,
alimento,
food supplies,
tem indústria
that has
sofisticada,
sophisticated industry,
tem capacidade,
that has the
povo
capacity,
trabalhador,
that has a
e
hard-working
tem
people,
uma grande riqueza,
and that has a
que eu acho
great
que nós
wealth
criamos.
that I think
Nós
we created.
percebemos que ela existe.
We understood
Essa
that it
história de
existed.
distribuição de
Because
renda,
this story of income
ela
distribution,
tem sentido
it has a
ético,
sense of ethics.
tem sentido de
It has a
valor,
sense of worth.
mas ela cria mercado.
It creates the internal market.
Por que que os emergentes
Why are the emerging countries,
como o Brasil,
such as
a Rússia, a
Brazil,
China e a
Russia, China,
São
India,
países importantes.
important countries?
Porque são países
Because
com
they are
grandes
countries
mercados
with
internos.
large internal markets.
São importantes.
They are important,
Seja para sua
be it
própria
for their own
indústria,
industries,
seja para sua própria
be it for their
prestação
own
de
provision of
serviços,
services,
mas também
but
como
also as
consumidores
consumers of products
produtos de
from
outros
other
países.
countries.
Há
There
um
is a
grande
great
valor no
value
mercado
in the
interno.
internal market.
E apostar que
And
além,
wagering that beyond
de
producers,
produtores, de pessoas,
beyond
por que
people,
que
why
eles-
is it that
nós
we had to
tivemos de
construct
fazer, 12
12
grandes
large
aeroportos?
airports?
Foi por causa da
Because-
Copa?
was it because of
Foi
the
por causa
Cup?
da Olimpíada? Não
Was
foi,
it because
não.
of the
Foi
Olympics?
porque
No,
o
it
nível
wasn't.
de pressão
It was
de
because the
gente que
pressure
nunca tinha
level of the
entrado no
number
avião,
of people
que
who had
achavam
never been on an
que
airplane,
nunca ia entrar,
that thought they would
começaram a
never
entrar
be
no
able
avião.
to, began to
Então,
travel
a
by
pessoa
airplane.
sentava no avião,
And so a
ao lado
person
dela
sat on
tinha
an
uma
airplane,
empregada doméstica,
and
do
next
outro
to them
lado
was
tinha
a
porteiro,
housekeeper, and on the other side
porque
was a
teve
doorman,
acesso ao
because
voo.
there was access to
E
flights.
isso foi muito importante.
And this was
Isso
very
foi
important.
algo
This was
essencial.
something
Eu
essential.
lembro
I remember a
formatura
ProUni
do
graduation.
O ProUni é aquele
ProUni is
programa
that
que
program
nós
with which we expanded university
resolvemos
education.
expandir o ensino universitário,
Because
porque o
university
ensino
education
universitário era
was
para
for
uma
a
elite
Brazilian
brasileira.
elite.
Nós então resolvemos expandir o ensino
And so we
o
decided to
o
expand
ensino universitário.
university
Além de
education.
expandir
Beyond
na
expansion
esfera
in the
pública,
public
nós
sphere,
expandimos na
we
esfera
also
privada.
expanded
Como é que
in the
você
private
expande na
sphere.
esfera privada?
How do you
Nós
expand in the
resolvemos
private sphere?
trocar imposto
We decided to
imposto
exchange taxes,
por
right?
bolsa na universidade.
For scholastic
Esse
scholarships.
programa,
This program, ProUni, produced many graduates.
depois disso nós fizemos
After
também
this, we
programa de
created the
cotas,
Affirmative
etc.
Action Program.
O rosto do universitário brasileiro, da
The
universidade
face of the
brasileira
Brazilian
mudou, porque o
university
Brasil
changed
é
because
grande
Brazil is a
país
country with a
também
large
negro.
African
Nós somos o
population.
maior
We
país
are the
negro
largest
fora da África.
population of black people outside of Africa. So,
Uma
a
estudante
student
que formou
that graduated with a medical degree,
negra,
a black student,
fez discurso que começava o seguinte,
gave a speech that
começava
started
assim,
with the following.
a casa grande
It started
surta,
like this. The big house freaks out
a senzala
when the
vira médica.
slave quarters becomes
E
a
a
doctor.
senzala no Brasil começou a virar médica.
And the slave quarters of Brazil started to become
De
doctors.
inclusão,
This
ele não é
process of
só de
inclusion
renda.
is not only
Ele é
about
também de
income,
valores. E ele é
it's
processo
also about
complexo. Eu não
values.
sei se vocês viram que na minha
and it's a
exposição,
complex
vocês-
process.
tinha uma
I don't
frase
know if you all saw
que era
here,
assim, "O
I don't know if
fim
it
da
came up in my
miséria é só o
presentation.
começo."
There was a phrase that
Porque o
went
fim
like
da
this:
miséria é só o começo.
the end of
E eu vou
poverty
dizer pra
is
vocês
only the
aqui
beginning.
uma grande
Because the end of
dificuldade,
poverty is only the beginning.
extrema dificuldade.
And I will say to you all here,
Distribui-
this was a great
distribui
difficulty
renda.
that we had,
Dá
an
trabalho
extreme
fazer o
difficulty.
cadastro, dá
Because this
trabalho
thing of
distribuir
distribution of
o
income,
cartão,
it's a lot of work to
trabalho
create the
controlar.
registry. It's a lot of work
Mais-
to
é
distribute
mais
the credit
rápido
card.
do que
It's a
mudar o
lot of
serviço.
work to control it all. But
Mudar o
it's
serviço.
faster than changing the
Ou
service.
seja, oferta de
Changing the
serviço
service.
de
In other words,
educação.
the service
Implica
offer of
fazer
education
escola.
implies the
Implica
construction of schools,
ampliar
implies the expansion of
infraestrutura
physical
física.
infrastructure.
Então, tem vamos
And
dizer
so
assim,
there's
uma espécie de
let's say a sort of
contradição
temporal
temporal
contradiction between the distribution of income and the distribution of access to the
porque
services.
desigualdade você combate
Because
com
what
quê?
you have to
Você
do
combate
to combat
renda,
inequality, you
acesso
combat
a
it with
serviços, você tem de
income,
garantir
access to
acesso,
services.
oportunidade.
You have to guarantee
Oportunidade.
access and
As
opportunity.
pessoas são diferentes.
Opportunity.
As oportunidades,
People are
preferencialmente,
different.
têm que ser as mais
The
iguais
opportunities,
possível.
preferably,
Oportunidade de educar, de
have
ter
to be
assistência
as equal as
de saúde,
possible.
etc.
Opportunity to education,
E
to
você
healthcare, etc.
Dá acesso a
And
esses
you have to make
serviços
these
que
services
que foram
accessible.
conformados
These services
pequena-
that were
uma pequena
modeled
parte
for a
da-
small part
da-
of the
da
population.
população. Aí você imagina
And so you can
o que
imagine
que é bando
a
de
band of
brasileiros
Brazilians
invadindo os
invaded
aeroportos.
the airports.
Imagina o quanto que a mala
Imagine
atrasa.
how long it takes to get
Imagina
your
o rolo
suitcase.
que dá.
Imagine the
Então,
chaos.
Nós tivemos de investir em ampliar
And
os
so we had to
aeroportos. Pode ir lá,
invest in the
agora tá-
expansion of airports.
Tem bons aeroportos.
You can go there now. The
Mas-
airports are very
mas deu
good.
trabalhão, pessoal.
But it was a
Pessoal
lot
briga,
of work.
pessoal fala mal,
A lot.
É normal. e tudo
People
faz parte.
argue. People
Porque
insult
o
each
fim da
other. It's
miséria
normal that they
é
do
só o
this.
começo.
Because
É o
the
começo
end of
de
extreme
todas as
poverty
exigências
is
que
only the
cada
beginning.
de nós tem.
It's the start
têm
of
direito igual
all
de ter.
the demands that each of us has.
Então,
They have the same right to them.
essa é uma complicação que
And
todo
so
mundo
this
tem
is
de
a
encarar
complication that
quando
everyone has
você
to
tá
confront
tentando resolver o
when you are
problema
trying to
da
resolve
qualidade
the
de
quality
vida
of
da
life
sua
of your
população.
population.
This is a question from Ariel Schusterman, and I'm going to take advantage of saying Chag Sameach for people here today who understand what that means. And President Rousseff, I would like to thank you again for coming to speak at Brown. With the onset of right-wing and neoliberal governments recently taking power in your country, as well as several other South American countries, many analysts are reviewing these changes as a sign that the left and pink tide seria onda social-democrata, movement in South America is weakening. As one of the leaders who took power as part of the pink tide, what are your views on the future of this movement in your country and in the region as a whole?
Olha, assim, do ponto de vista
From the pragmatic point of view, the most pragmatic possible, what's happening is in fact a moment of more conservative governments. We in Latin America,
nós nadamos.
we swim against the current.
Se você for olhar,
If you were to look at almost all of the Latin American countries,
Argentina,
Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia,
você teve processo.
there was a process of immense reduction in inequality.
Enquanto isso,
While
no resto do mundo,
in the rest of the world,
principalmente nos países desenvolvidos,
especially in the
houve
developed
processo
countries,
de aceleração da
there was a
desigualdade
process of
como
accelerating
nunca antes,
inequality
inclusive aqui nos
as
Estados
never
Unidos.
before seen,
Você tem
including here in the United
processo
States.
de
You
aumento
have a process of increased
aumento
job
da
insecurity,
precarização do trabalho, uma redução
a
em salário.
reduction
Você
in
tem uma
salary.
situação
You have a very
bastante
difficult
difícil
situation
aqui
here
na Europa,
and in Europe
em termos de desigualdade.
in terms
Em
of
todos os
inequality.
países do mundo se discute essa
In
questão.
all the countries of
Eu
the
acho
world, this is a
que
matter
tem
which is discussed.
Uma tríade.
And I think there is a triad,
Aumenta
which is
a
like this.
financiarização
Increase financialization
e as
and the
políticas
state's
mais
more
neoliberais, de
neoliberal
retirada
policies
do
of
Estado de
cutbacks
algumas atividades.
increase.
Aí aumenta a
And
desigualdade.
so increases inequality,
Até porque no caso da
especially because in the
financiarização,
case of
você tem
financialization,
os bancos,
you have,
ao contrário do que era
contrary
antes, não
to
sendo
how it was
suporte
before,
das atividades produtivas. E você tem uma
the banks are
distribuição
no longer a support of productive
através
activities.
de
And you
lucros
have a
acionistas, de
distribution through
dividendos, de
shareholder
pagamento de
profits,
bônus para
through
CEOs
dividends,
e
and through
concentra
bonus payments
violentamente a riqueza.
for those
Aí
who
aumenta a
violently
desigualdade.
concentrate the
Quando
wealth.
aumenta a desigualdade, ocorre
And so
um
inequality
fenômeno muito
increases.
perigoso.
When inequality increases,
Quando aumenta
there
a
occurs a very
desigualdade,
dangerous
a
phenomenon.
população e as pessoas
When inequality
olham pros
increases, the
e acham
population
o
and the
governo
people look to the government, and they think the government is innocuous,
ineficaz.
inoperative,
Política
ineffective.
perde valor.
Politics loses its
Quando a
value.
política perde valor, abre
When
grande
politics
espaço
loses its
para
value,
salvadores da
a
pátria,
great space
para
is
tudo.
opened up for saviors of the
no
homeland,
Brasil
for everything.
e na América
Today
Latina,
in Brazil
eu
and
acho
in
que
Latin
nós
America,
estamos vivendo
I think we are
ressurgimento
living through a
desse
resurgence
processo.
of this
Para mim, o
process.
golpe em mim foi dado para
For me, the
implantar o
coup was staged in
neoliberalismo
order
que
to
nós tínhamos
implant
interrompido
neoliberalism,
quando Lula
which we had interrupted
chegou
when
ao
Lula took
governo.
office.
Ele vinha desde o Collor, passou pelo
We
Fernando
interrupted
Henrique,
this
e nós
neoliberalism,
interrompemos.
which had been around since the
Agora,
time of Collor and continued with
o que eu
Henrique
acho que vai
Cardoso.
acontecer é,
What
nós
I think
estamos
will
na
happen
onda
now, we're
conservadora.
riding a conservative
Essa
wave.
onda conservadora
This
na
conservative
América
wave in the
Latina
poorer
pobre,
areas of Latin
ela é muito
America
perigosa.
is very dangerous.
Por quê?
Why?
Porque ela
Because it
reduz a
reduces the
capacidade do
capacity of the
Estado de
state
responder
to
às
respond to the
demandas da
demands of the
população.
populace.
Como são demandas,
Being
não
as
só
they
as
are
correntes,
demands,
mas tem
not
estoque
only the
de dívida.
trends, there is also
Tem
a stock
estoque
of
de
debt.
dívida social.
There is a stock of
Nós não
social debt.
tivemos aqui o mesmo
We didn't
padrão.
have
Nós não
here the
tivemos
same
lá o
standard.
mesmo
We didn't have
padrão
there
de
the
ensino.
same
Nós não
standard
tivemos lá,
of education.
bom,
We didn't have the
mesmo
same
quando
focus
tem
on
crise num
crisis
país mais
as a
desenvolvido,
more
você tem
developed
estoque
country.
acumulado.
There's an
Nós não
accumulated
temos.
stock,
Então, torna muito
and it becomes a
disruptiva
very
situação.
disruptive
Eu acho que é
situation.
uma onda momentânea,
I think it's a momentous
conservadora,
conservative wave,
não sei como
which
vira,
I don't know how
e
to
fico
quell,
muito preocupado.
and I'm
Por
very
quê?
worried.
O que nós estávamos
Because we were
encaminhando era uma
leading up
solução dentro da
to a
democracia.
solution
O que
within
nós
democracy.
estávamos encaminhando era uma
What we were
solução
leading
em
up
que se
to was a
preserva
solution which
as mais
preserved the most
importantes
important
instituições
democratic
democráticas, que são,
institutions,
eu acredito,
which are,
dos maiores
I
avanços
believe,
civilizatórios que o mundo teve.
one of the greatest civilizing
Criar
advances
as
of the world.
condições para a disrupção, por
To
certo
create the
tipo
conditions
de
for
confronto,
disruption,
certo tipo de
for a certain
violência,
kind of
eu acho
conflict,
gravíssimo.
for a
Então,
certain kind of
quanto mais cedo
violence,
a América Latina
I find it to
voltar
be
por esse
extremely
caminho que você tá
grave.
chamando de rosa,
So,
né?
I think the sooner
Eu acho
Latin
melhor.
America returns to this path that you're calling pink, right?
Outras pessoas
The
chamaram
better.
de rosa, mas eu estou repetindo a pergunta.
Não que eu não goste da cor.
It's
viu,
not that
gente?
I don't like the color, all right?
She said that she doesn't.
Não é
it's nothing
bem a
against
minha
the color.
cor.
It's
But
nothing against
it's
the
not
color
exactly
pink
my
that she has
color.
any objections to it. It's just an expression. This is a question from Rejane Musis, and it's in Portuguese, but I'm going to translate it to English. Presidente Dilma Rousseff, the PT, the Workers' Party, suffered political persecution from the media, and because of this, there was the impeachment. What will be the strategy for the reconstruction of this party after all of this massacre?
Olha, eu acredito.
Look, I believe the fight against corruption in Brazil is essential.
E eu falo
And I
isso
say
também
this too,
porque
because
esse combate à
this
corrupção
fight
se tornou
against
possível
corruption
por
was
várias
made
medidas que
possible
nós tomamos.
through various measures that
Eu
we
queria
took.
citar uma, que é a
I'd like
Lei
to
de
cite one,
contra
which is the
o
law
combate
of
a organizações criminosas,
against criminal
permitiu
organizations,
a
which
existência
allowed
do
for the
estatuto
statute of plea
da
bargaining,
delação premiada,
and
de outro
another
estatuto, que
statute,
é
which is
o fato que no
the
Brasil
fact that
só
in Brazil,
o corrupto
only the
era
corrupt were
punido, o
punished.
corruptor
The
era
corruptor
mais ou
was
menos.
only more or less
Então, nós
so.
tornamos claro
And so we made
que a
clear
corrupção
that
passiva e
passive
ativa
and
eram
active
passíveis de
corruption
punição.
were subject to punishment.
Eu acho que
So,
combater
I think
corrupção
fighting
é
against
essencial,
corruption is
em
essential,
principalmente,
and
aliás, em
particularly,
qualquer país
actually,
do
in
mundo.
any
Agora,
country in the
eu
world.
acho que ninguém é
Now,
ingênuo também.
I don't think
Né?
anyone
Você
is
tem
naive. You have a tradition in Latin America of fighting against corruption, utilizing this instrument as a political and ideological instrument. And so you begin to commit lawfare. In other words, what is lawfare? It's the use of the law to persecute your enemies. And so, first, you judge them before the actual ruling, be it through the media, be it through a number of different processes. I think that whoever corrupts ought to pay. Whoever corrupts ought to pay. Whoever is corrupted ought to pay. Now, what's impossible to do, for example, in the case of the companies, is to destroy the company. That is impossible. The largest corruption scandal in the world in the last few years was the subprime mortgage crisis. Billions and billions of dollars and euros were involved in the subprime mortgage crisis. It was the greatest corruption crisis, I believe, of the century, of this century, and of the past century. There had never been a moment in international history which involved so much money and in which so much money landed so unduly in the hands of some. This doesn't mean that you had to break the whole financial system. All of those that participated. Now, I do agree that you should punish the corruptors. Punish those who misappropriated all of these funds. Yes, this I agree with. Now in Brazil, what's serious is that they are invalidating companies. Companies are companies. It's the executives, employees, politicians, whomever it may be, that need to be punished. And let's not believe that it's only a political question. It's not the question of politicians. It's a question of the society in general. Because there's no way of supposing. Why does a question here? Why does someone put money into slush funds? Do you know? So they don't have to pay taxes. Because the second they pay into regulated funds, they have to pay taxes. With the slush fund, you don't have to pay taxes. And so, really getting into this, it's the same thing with political parties. Political parties have to survive. Whoever has committed a crime ought to pay for it. And I want to say that we also created a political system completely subject to the possibility of corruption and cronyism. Why? Because of the following. It's possible to have 25, in my period, today there are more, it's possible to have 25 parties in the National Congress. Do you believe that 25 parties have an agenda, each one of them, for a country such as Brazil? No, they don't. So, what are the 25 existing parties doing? Why do they exist? I'll explain. We had an election threshold. You can only be a political party if you have X number of votes, such and such number of representatives, this and that. This election threshold fell to the Supreme Court because it was considered anti-democratic. So, together with this threshold, which was knocked down, there were two other democratic clauses. Party funding, to prevent the party from relying on private contributions, and the other was airtime, to prevent the 4 or 5 Brazilian media groups, controlled by 5 oligopoly families, from deciding the election. So, these two clauses are important clauses. When combined with the fall of the election threshold, what happens? An incentive to form political parties that negotiate what? They negotiate the party funding in order to have access to it. They negotiate airtime, and they buy and sell airtime. So another problem is created. Since they don't participate in the electoral process, they don't gain access to the presidency. In other words, They don't run for executive office.
Como é que eles acessam?
How do they gain access to political power?
Eles querem negociar cargos.
They want to negotiate positions, amendments, and benefits.
Então você não pode ter
So,
sistema
you can have a
político
political
que
system
seja,
that gives
que
opportunity
seja,
to
que reproduz
and
práticas
reproduces
incorretas.
inappropriate practices.
Quando em 2013 nós
When in
propusemos
2013
reforma política, eu
we
cansei de propor
proposed our
reforma
political
política.
reform,
Primeiro, eu assisti duas propostas
I'm tired of
do governo do
proposing
presidente
political
Lula,
reforms.
E nós perdemos as duas.
First, I witnessed two
Aí,
proposals in
em
the Lula
2000,
administration,
nós
and we lost them
começamos em
both.
2012,
And in
em
2000, we
2013
started in
nós fizemos a
2012.
nossa
In
proposta.
2013, we created our
Fomos
proposal. We were rejected
rotundamente,
outright.
Levamos olé.
If I can be frank, we lost. We weren't able
Sendo
to
assim
get it
muito clara,
across.
Não perdemos, não conseguimos fazer o trânsito. Agora, no Brasil,
Now in Brazil,
duas coisas
two
são
things
muito
are very
importantes
important from here on out.
daqui para frente. Em
In
2018,
2018,
nós temos encontro
we
com a
have a date with
democracia.
democracy.
É hora de construir pacto social. Não que ele
It's
vai,
time to create a
toda eleição
social
ele vai
pact.
surgir assim, não, mas a
And it's
eleição
not just because of the
é a
election that this
legitimação
pact will come
da
about,
base. Quem ganhar a eleição,
but the
ganhou,
election is the
né?
basis of legitimation.
Seja quem for, você tem de
Whoever
reconhecer.
wins the election will win. Whoever it
É a
may
base
be,
para repactuar
you have to
o
recognize the
Brasil.
vote.
Não vale é tirar pessoas
It is
do
the
tapetão,
basis for
como dizem no
reestablishing the
futebol.
social
Não
contract.
vale tirar
It's
do
not worth
tapetão
taking people out of the
nenhum candidato que
tapetão,
pode
as they say
ganhar.
in
Vocês
soccer.
sabem ao quem eu me
It's not
refiro.
worth taking any worthy candidate from the soccer
vale
tribunal.
Então,
You
você
all
tem
know who
esse
I'm referring
encontro,
to.
Tem outro encontro.
It's not worth
Você
it.
tem de fazer uma reforma
So you have
política
this
no Brasil.
date. But
E
you
eu
have
não
another date.
acredito
You
que a
have to create
raposa
political reform in Brazil.
reforme o galinheiro.
And I don't believe that
Ela
the
não
fox
reforma o galinheiro.
reforms the chicken coop.
Quem pode
The
reformar
fox does not reform
é
the
uma
chicken coop.
constituinte exclusiva.
An exclusive
ninguém vai
constituency
tirar de si
can enact
mesmo
these reforms.
As suas próprias
Because
vantagens.
no one will try to take advantage
Mais
of
uma
themselves.
constituinte exclusiva
But
para
an
a
exclusive
questão da reforma
constituency
política, porque
in
você
regards
pode
to the
perguntar,
political
faça
reform.
uma pesquisa no Brasil.
Because you can ask,
Pergunte, o que que você
do a
acha que
survey in
deve ser
Brazil.
feito?
Ask, what do you think should be done?
11
11
pessoas
out of
vão
10
responder
people
reforma
will
política.
tell you political
Porque
reform.
é
Because
algo
it's something
fundamental
fundamental
pro país.
for the country.
A gente
We
dá
can go a
passo
step
além
beyond
nesse processo de
this
redemocratização
redemocratizing
que nós
process
construímos a
that we
partir
created
de
from
1988.
1988 onward.
The next question I think might have already been answered, but I'll read it and you can answer it if you think you need to answer it more. This is from Ryan Lee, International Relations Students, class of 2017. What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of a two-party system versus a multi-party political system?
Eu acho que cada
I
tem
think
seus
each one
problemas.
has its problems.
Eu conheço
I am
pouco
not very
o
familiar with the
partidarismo
two-party
aqui.
system here,
Agora acredito que também
but I
não
also
precisa de
believe that it
ser
doesn't need to
partidário.
be just
Não
two
é essa a
parties.
posição, essa é uma questão
This isn't the
falsa.
position. It's
Não
a false
precisa de ser
concern.
25.
Doesn't need to be
Agora,
25,
não precisa de
but
ser
it
2.
also doesn't need to be 2, right?
Né?
This is from Joshua Kennedy, Investment Director of the Investment Office at Brown University. Why is Brazil's political class so seemingly corrupt? How should it be cleaned up?
Primeiro, eu não acho
First
que
of
é
all,
só
I
a
don't
classe
think it's a
política,
matter just of the political
né? A minha
class.
tradição não é o meu primeiro
My
cargo, o
tradition,
único cargo que
my
eu
first
concorri na
office,
vida
the
foi para
only
presidente
office
da
I ran for
República.
was the presidency.
Então, quero dizer para vocês o seguinte, eu não concordo
So what I
com
want to
isso,
say
não.
is the following,
Por que eu não concordo?
that I don't agree with this now.
Eu não
Why
acho
don't I agree?
Que tem bando
Because
de
I don't
políticos
think that there's a
corruptos e
band
bando
of
de
corrupt
empresários
politicians
santos e
and a
brando de
band of
população
saintly
mais santa
executives
ainda.
and an even saintlier
Eu não
band of the
acredito nisso,
population.
não.
I don't believe in this, no.
E eu acho essa uma versão,
I think
ela
that this
não
is
é
a
simplória.
version. It's not an
ela é uma
innocent version.
versão que tem por objetivo alguma coisa.
It's a version
E
with
pra
a
mim,
specific
coisa mais
objective.
grave que tem,
And for me,
é
the
a
most serious
despolitização.
thing there is
Por que
is
que é mais grave?
depoliticization.
Eu tô na minha
Why is it
fase,
the most
um
serious?
dia eu disse, eu tô na minha
I'm in
fase
my
grega.
phase. I said the other day I'm in my
Sabe por
Greek
quê?
phase.
Porque
I'll
a
explain
política
why.
nasceu com a democracia.
Because politics were
Não há
born with
democracia
democracy.
possível sem a
There
política.
is no
Eu
possible
escutei uma
democracy
coisa
without
estarrecedora
politics.
recentemente,
I heard something
que era
terrifying
o
recently,
diálogo.
which was dialogue, right?
Parecia que as pessoas
It
acreditavam
seemed that the people believed that the problem of
problema
modernity
da
That was
Na
in
modernidade.
Harvard. In Harvard?
foi
Okay.
O problema da modernidade
The problem
era
of modernity
simplesmente a
was
ausência
simply
de
the
diálogo.
lack of dialogue.
Não acho que é isso.
I don't think
Eu
this
acho
is
que a
it.
questão da democracia
I think that the issue of
é a
democracy
questão de como
is a
é que
question
é
of how
conjunto,
a group
conjunto de 200
of
milhões de
200
habitantes
million
não tem
inhabitants
como eles dialogarem.
are not
Sabe,
able to
sento-
dialogue.
Não tem diálogo.
You know, I sit, there isn't a dialogue
uma
between
pessoa
one
e outra em
person
200 milhões
and
de
another
habitantes. Você tem
among
estruturas.
200
Então,
million
a
inhabitants.
a troca
You have
de
structures
opiniões,
that permit
a
discussion,
troca de
the
impressões.
exchange of ideas,
Que
the
é isso?
exchange of
A
impressions.
democracia,
What is
ela
this?
exige que haja uma
Democracy
grupo de
requires a group
pessoas
of
que
people
queira tratar
that want
da
to take
questão
care of the concerns
de
of
todos,
everyone,
não só da sua.
not just their
Eu não
own.
quero tratar só do meu problema.
I
meu
don't
problema,
want to take care
segundo
of
os
just my
gregos, eu tratava
problems.
na economia.
My problem,
Na
according to the
política, eu
Greeks,
sou obrigada
I
a
resolve
tratar
in the
da
economy.
questão que diz
In
respeito
politics,
a uma
I am
população,
obligated to
a uma
resolve the problems that
comunidade
affect
e a um
the
grupo.
populace,
E
the
até
community,
agora,
the group.
assim como não
And until
inventaram
now,
nada melhor
as they
que a
haven't invented
democracia,
anything
não-
better than
não acho
democracy,
que haja nada
I don't
melhor
believe
que
there
o
is
partido
anything
político,
better
cheios
than the
de
political
defeitos,
party,
como a democracia,
full of
mas
flaws,
efetivos.
like democracy, but
Além
effective.
disso, tem as organizações
Beyond
da sociedade
this,
civil.
there are the
Além disso,
several
tem as
social
organizações
organizations,
que
the professional
representam
organizations.
profissões. Ou seja, há
In other words,
processo
there is
da
a
democracia
process in
moderna
modern
em que
democracy
todos esses
in which
elementos
all
têm
of
que
these
ser
elements have to be
estruturados.
structured.
Até hoje, eu não vi nenhuma
Until now,
proposta
I haven't found any
substitua
proposal
a política
that would
no
substitute
sentido
politics
nesse
in this way.
sentido. Por quê? Os
because the
partidos são
political
uma
parties
parte
are a
que
part
tem uma
that have a
visão
political vision.
política, ou seja, uma
In
parte
other words,
que acha
one part believes
resolver o problema de
resolving the
todos é
problem
por
of
ali.
everyone happens this
O
way,
outro acha que
and
resolver
another
o
part
problema
thinks
de
that it
todos é
happens
por
that
ali.
way.
Mas você tem de organizar
But you have to
minimamente
organize,
esse processo.
at the very least,
É impossível a
this
gente
process.
achar que há uma praça na qual todos
It's
nós
impossible for us
dialogaremos
to
como se
believe
fosse
that there
a
is
água.
some public
Não há
square
isso.
in which all of us will dialogue
Nós
as if
hoje
it were an
temos
assembly.
O mundo
This doesn't
digital,
exist.
que facilita algumas
Today,
coisas, que pode
we have a
facilitar, que
digital
pode
world
ensejar
which facilitates some
maior-
things, which can
um
facilitate,
maior
which can make
contraditório,
possible
porque eu acho
a
que
large
a
contradictory
base
proposition.
disso é o
The
contraditório.
basis for
É
this
quando se
contradiction.
descobre que a outra pessoa
It's when you
fala, "Mas você tá
discover
errado
that the
nisso",
other
e
person
você
says,
é
ah, but
capaz
you're wrong
de
in this.
incorporar
And you
o
are
que
able to
você acha que
incorporate
ela tá
what they've
falando
said into your
de bem
argument.
pra você. Então, eu vou dizer
So,
pra vocês.
I
eu
will
não
say to you all,
concordo que partido político é
I
o
don't agree that
fulcro-
political parties
o
are the
fulcro
fulcrum of
do
evil
mal e o resto
and
é
the
o fulcro do
rest
bem.
are the fulcrum of
Sugiro
good.
que todo mundo que escuta a mídia
I
brasileira
suggest
falando isso,
that anyone who listens to
sem
the Brazilian
pulgas
media
atrás
saying
de
this
cada orelha.
ought to find 100 fleas behind
Sem
their
pulgas.
ears. 100 fleas.
This is from Nathaniel Petit, a first-year student. He shopped my first-year seminar, my history of Brazil, and decided to take neither. But after I read this, I realized that I know why. Listen to this one. With the recent passage of PEC 55, the constitutional amendment that freezes spending in the public sector for the next 20 years, many discretionary social programs face the reality of dramatic cuts that may put these programs on a starving diet. One such program is Bolsa Família, the national conditional transfer program credited with lifting millions of Brazilian families from poverty and decreasing inequality by 15% in its first 10 years of existence. Many critics of the program believe its central flaw is its lack of legal or constitutional guarantee, thereby creating a central transience and unaccountability for the 14 million Brazilian families that depend on it for a crucial lifeline. Do you believe it is possible for Bolsa Família to eventually be grounded in some legal guarantee? Along that line of thinking, do you believe that the nation can reclaim its path towards the eventual implementation of universal basic income as envisioned by Senator Eduardo Suplicy? And Nathan, could you take my graduate seminar next semester, please?
Olha, eu acho que nessa altura do
Look, I think at this
campeonato,
point in the
alguém
game,
achar que garante programa,
for someone to think that guaranteeing a
medida
program by
legal,
legal measure,
vendo tudo que está
seeing
acontecendo no Brasil, é uma
everything that's
possibilidade.
going on in Brazil,
Não é essa a
it's
questão. Você
brinkmanship.
pode até passar
This isn't the
uma medida
question.
legal.
You can pass it through
Agora,
legal
Vocês
measures.
sabem que mudam
But
a
do you
lei
all
por
know what
medida
it
legal?
means to change a law through legal
Nós estamos
measures?
assistindo isso com reforma da Previdência,
We are
emenda
witnessing this
constitucional,
with the Social
emenda à
Security
Constituição,
reform,
Dois
the
terços do
constitutional
voto.
amendment.
Emenda 55.
And the amendment to the Constitution,
Ela
two-thirds
atinge
of the
o Bolsa
vote.
Família com tiro na
Amendment
testa.
55, it hits Bolsa Familia like a shot in the forehead.
A gente tem de perceber
So
que o
we
que
have
dá
to
certo
realize
com o Bolsa
that
Família é
what
você ter
works with
a
Bolsa Familia
obrigação de fazer politicamente.
is its
No
political
Brasil, com essa
obligation.
fragilidade institucional em relação
In
às
Brazil,
leis,
with this institutional
dificuldade
fragility
imensa de
in
você
regards to the laws, with the
manter
immense difficulty
e não deixar
of
que o
maintaining
retrocesso
and not
seria
allowing
bom
for
até para dar mais
regression,
trabalho para eles que a gente tivesse
it would even be good just to give them more work
colocado
had
como
we
uma
placed the
obrigação
constitutional
constitucional o Bolsa
obligation
Família.
on Bolsa Familia.
Agora, eu não acho que a proposta
Now,
do senador Eduardo
I
Suplicy
don't believe that Senator Eduardo Suplici's proposal is our Bolsa Familia.
o senador
I
Eduardo
want to let
Suplicy
you know this.
propunha
It's not.
simplesmente uma renda mínima
Senator
nacional.
Eduardo Suplicy
Nós fizemos,
simply proposes a
tem
minimum
problema de
national
recursos,
income.
nós
What we
focamos
did,
na linha,
especially because there's a
miséria,
problem of national
né,
resources,
e também da pobreza.
we
Nós
focused on the
focamos
poverty
nessa
line
linha. E
and the
ali,
line of
o que
extreme
nós
poverty.
fizemos foi,
We focused on
nós
this line.
acabamos com o mapa da
And
fome
what we
e
did there
superamos a
was that
miséria
we
extrema.
got
O
off
Brasil
the hunger
saiu
map
da miséria extrema em
and we
2018.
overcame extreme poverty.
Saiu comprovado.
Brazil got out of extreme poverty in
Eu acho
2014. There's evidence in everything.
O que nós conquistamos podia até
I think
encaminhar num
what
momento
we overcame
pouco mais à
could
frente
lead
pra
to
uma
a
renda
moment
mínima.
sometime in the
Agora, tem que
future
avaliar se isso é
of a minimum
viável
income.
orçamentariamente. Não
But
é
you
algo
have to
que
evaluate
você
if this is
acha
possible
que
within the
pensa
budget.
e fala, eu vou
It's
fazer
not
isso
just
e
something
sai
you
feito.
talk about or
Não é
think
assim a vida.
about and say, I'm going to do
Principalmente
this
Bolsa
and it's
Família.
done.
Pra nós
Life's not
fazermos
like
o Bolsa
that.
Família, e ele
Bolsa
estar
Família in
inteiro, nós
particular.
levamos de
For us to create
2003
Bolsa
a
Familia
2012.
and for it to be intact,
Em
we
2012,
took from 2003 to
vamos dizer
2012.
assim, os instrumentos
In
principais estavam
2012,
completos. Porque nós
let's say it
sabemos
like
a
this.
quem dar.
The principal
É óbvio que
instruments were
simplificar
completed.
a questão é fazer
Because we
uma
knew
renda
who to
mínima
give them
nacional,
to.
mas aí eu não teria
It's
marco no
obvious that
cadastro
creating a minimum national
pra fazer
income
o
simplifies
programa
the
Mais
question.
Médicos,
But I
eu
wouldn't
não
have the
teria o
map
cadastro pra fazer
or
a
the
distribuição
registry
do Minha
to
Casa
create the
Minha
Mais
Vida,
Magicos
porque
program.
não é só
I
uma
wouldn't have the
renda.
registry to create the
A gente
housing
tem que perceber
program
que o Brasil
because
fez
it's not
distribuição de
just
riqueza.
income.
E uma
We
parte
have to
de
realize
distribuição de
that
riqueza.
Brazil created an
O
income
que é
distribution
distribuição de riqueza?
and a part of
Distribuição
wealth
de
in
riqueza
distribution.
Você faz com taxação,
What is
com
wealth
imposto,
distribution?
né? O
Wealth
Pickett tem
distribution is
razão,
done
tem
through
que ter imposto.
taxation, with taxes.
Mas você faz
Pickett is
também
right. There
dando
has to be
acesso à
taxes.
riqueza. Riqueza
But
é
what
terra,
is also done by providing
riqueza
access to
é
wealth?
casa,
Wealth is land,
tô falando pra uma
wealth is
população,
housing.
né? Riqueza,
I'm speaking for a
obviamente,
certain population, right?
é títulos, etc,
Wealth
etc.
obviously is
Mas
titles
pra
and
população,
such,
essas duas coisas.
but for the
Nós não
populace, it's
fizemos
these
só
two
distribuição de
things.
renda. Nós
We
fizemos
didn't
distribuição
only
de
create
riqueza.
income distribution,
Não é
we
trivial
also created wealth
ter
distribution.
feito
It's not trivial to
4
have created
milhões e 100 mil
4.1 million
Não é
homes.
trivial
It's not trivial.
você,
It's
dessas
not
4
trivial.
milhões e 100 mil
You-
casas, a
Of these
faixa mais
4.1
baixa, porque também tinha
million
intermediária,
homes,
mas eu quero só
the
falar da
lowest
faixa mais
bracket,
baixa, chegou a
because
quase
there's
80%.
also the intermediate, but I want to speak only of the lowest bracket,
Quase 50%
reached almost 2 million
ganhava
homes
até
of the
1.600
four.
reais.
Almost
Isso
50%
significa
belong to those that gained up to
gente que
1,600
morava,
reais.
eu
This
até
means that people
muitas
that
vezes
lived,
disse isso pra ti, né? Eu acho
I've
esse
even
o
said this to you
programa
many
mais forte.
times. I think this is our
Gente que
strongest
morava,
program.
Em beira de
People
rio,
that lived on
beira de
riverbanks, on the
fundos
sides
de
of
vales,
streams,
e, portanto,
at the bottom of
tinha
valleys,
grande risco até de sobreviver nessas
consequently, where there was a great risk for survival in these
condições,
conditions,
a um outro
these
ambiente,
people,
onde elas iam fazer o
they
quê?
had
Criar seus
access
filhos.
to another
Esse outro
environment
ambiente, ele é
where they would do
completamente
what?
diferente, porque
Raise their children.
nós,
This
como uma
other
vez disse
environment,
Lula,
it
nós
was
não
completely
fazíamos-
different
tem uma
because
expressão
we,
na gíria
as Lula once
pernambucana,
said,
chama
we
muquifo.
didn't, there's an
Muquifo
expression in Pernambucan
uma
slang
casa
called
muito-
mukifo.
É barraco.
Mukifo is
Nós
a
não fazíamos
very,
Nós fazíamos
it's a
casas
shack.
que tinha.
We didn't
Tinha de
create
olhar.
mukifos.
Eu
We
fiquei
created
até-
homes
até
that had
especialista.
to be inspected.
Eu olhava
I became a
o
specialist.
rodapé,
I
o
would
tamanho
inspect
da
the
janela, tinha 2
baseboards,
quartos,
the
tinha
size of the
cozinha,
windows.
banheiro,
There were 2
tinha de olhar
bedrooms,
onde é que a mulher estendia
kitchen,
a roupa
a
depois de lavar.
bathroom. You had to inspect the area where the women would put the clothes to dry after washing.
Isso seria.
And so
você
we built
combina
decent
isso
homes for the people, for the families.
Bolsa Família,
This would be,
você
you
muda
combine
a
this with
vida
a
da
program like
pessoa,
Bolsa
você dá outra
Familia,
perspectiva
and you change
de
the person's
futuro pra
life.
ela.
You
Então,
give them
eu
another outlook
acho
on the future.
que programa
So,
não é de renda mínima
I think
só.
the program shouldn't just
Nós,
be
depois,
for
descobrimos três
a minimum
coisas, tá?
income.
Era renda,
After, we discovered
riqueza,
three
acesso a
things, okay?
serviços,
Income,
riqueza,
wealth,
uma coisa
access to services,
fundamental
and a fundamental
que
thing,
deu muito certo,
which
foi
worked out really well,
formação
was
profissional.
the vocational
E
training.
nós fizemos programa chamado
We created a
Pronatec.
program called
Esse
Pronatec.
programa
This
Pronatec
Pronatec
tinha
program
uma parte
had a
dele que
part
era
that was
só pra
just for Bolsa Família.
Quem dava o Pronatec?
Who
Os
contributed to
institutos
Pronatec?
federais e de ensino
The federal
tecnológico
institutions
do
for
país,
technological learning
federal, né?
of the country,
Mas nós
but
fizemos
we
uma
created a
parceria com o
partnership
pessoal
with a
do
group from Sistema S,
que era o pessoal das empresas.
which was a corporation
E esse
group.
pessoal formava
And this group trained
eletricistas.
electricians. They started with a
Começava por
basic
eletricista
course,
predial, passava para eletricista pouco mais
then they
complexo,
moved on to a slightly
formava,
more
quando
difficult
chegava no
course,
terceiro, ele podia
and
ser
graduated.
eletricista de
When they
estaleiro,
arrived at the third,
eletricista que
they could be
resolve o
electricians,
problema das fiações dentro de
electricians
uma
that worked on the
plataforma de
petroleum
petróleo.
platforms.
Então, se você não
So,
combinar os
if you don't
processos
combine the processes of social policies and connect them with
e
productive
ligá-los também à
activities,
atividade produtiva,
you won't get a
você não
country
tira o
out of
país da
extreme
miséria.
poverty.
Não é
It's
só
not
renda.
just income.
Renda é
Income is
fundamental,
fundamental,
mas não
but
é
it's not the only thing.
And this is our last question. This is from Rodrigo Fonseca, who's an assistant professor of computer sciences at Brown University. And he wrote it in Portuguese and in English, but I'll read it in English. Knowing what you know today, what would you have done differently starting in your campaign in 2014 and in your second term as president to avoid the impeachment and govern with a larger side of society and Congress by your side?
Olha, tinha algumas coisas que eu podia fazer,
Look, there are some things I could have done differently, but I'm not sure they would have been viable,
principalmente no
given the
ter
aligned
feito a
forces, right?
coligação
Particularly not
nós
having made the
fizemos
connection that we
com
made
o
with
meu
my
meu
current,
vice-presidente.
my vice president.
Vamos dizer, essa é a mais óbvia, né? Óbvio.
We can say that this is the most
Agora,
obvious.
Eu
Now,
cometi erro grave.
I made a grave
Eu
mistake.
fragilizei momento
I weakened,
as
for a
finanças do
moment,
país ao
the
isentar as
national
impostos.
finances by
Eu
exempting
gosto muito de
taxes.
falar nisso porque
I like very
essa é
much
uma
to speak
questão
about this because
que é
this is a
inevitável no Brasil.
forbidden matter
Nós
in
demos,
Brazil.
quando
We
nós
gave.
estávamos fazendo
When
a
we were
política
creating the
contracíclica,
countercyclical
impedindo-
policy,
tentando impedir que a
preventing the
crise
crisis
chegasse
from
no
making
Brasil,
its way to
nós
Brazil,
fizemos isenções
we
em
made
taxas.
tax exemptions.
Sejam impostos,
Be it
sejam
taxes, be it
contribuições, seja pagamento de
contributions,
impostos.
be it
O que
tax
nós
payments.
percebemos é que eles
What we
embolsaram
realized was that they
através-
pocketed.
eles não
They didn't
investiram
invest
mais
in more
emprego, não
jobs.
investiram em aumento
They
da
didn't
capacidade.
invest in
Eles
increasing
fizeram para
capacity.
aumentar a margem de lucro.
What they did was
Então,
expand their profit
eu falo
margins.
isso porque eu acho
And so
que
I say this because I
numa
think that
política
in a
cíclica
countercyclical
não cabe
policy,
aumentar
it's not
imposto, não,
possible
porque
to
não
raise taxes,
resulta em
no,
investimento.
because it doesn't result in investments.
Bom, companheira presidenta, I would like to say on behalf of Brown University, we're really happy that you're here. Volte logo e desculpe qualquer coisa.